It was the summer of 1947 when the letter arrived on my desk. Wrong envelope, wrong hands, or maybe right on time. The war had been over for 2 years. But inside me, it never ended. I worked in the Lost Correspondence Division of the American Red Cross in Kansas City. Every day I sorted through letters, damaged, redirected, delayed by censors, and many of them never meant to reach their destination. Most were ripped, unsigned, dead in spirit. But one stood out. It was addressed to Margaret Hale, Springfield, Illinois. And just like that, I couldn't breathe. Margaret, my Margaret. The woman I left behind in 1941 with a promise I couldn't keep. I still remember the station, her pale scarf waving, her hand trembling in mine. I was 22, full of belief in fast wars and short separations, but my name ended up on a different list, one labeled Missing in Action, and life, as I knew it, broke apart. That letter wasn't mine. It was written by another man, but the moment I read her name, I knew what I had to do. I was supposed to forward it. That was my job, but I didn't. I boarded a Greyhound eastbound with nothing but that envelope in my pocket and her name echoing in my head. Kansas City faded behind me in the bus window. Cornfields rolled past like waves of memory. I saw Margaret in every reflection. I imagined her older, waiting in silence, or maybe moved on. Each mile reopened wounds I thought had healed. When I arrived in Springfield, the town felt like a ghost of itself. Familiar streets blurred by time. The coffee shop where we used to meet was now a hardware store. The library still stood, though its doors were worn and its windows dim. But everything felt smaller, as if the war had shrunk the world and the people in it. I asked a woman at the corner store if she knew a Margaret Hale. She looked at me, long and quiet. She lives up by Oak Hill, alone, hasn't remarried. Her fiancé died overseas. My chest tightened. So she thought I was dead. I walked the long road to her house, an old 2-story with white shutters and ivy growing wild on the porch. I stood there for what felt like hours, letter in hand, time pressing against my back, and then I knocked. What happened next changed everything. If this story is already tugging at something in your heart the way it did mine while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. Returning to Springfield was like stepping through a cracked mirror. Everything was familiar, but bent, quiet, aged. The streets still followed the same lines, but the buildings bore scars from years of loss. Shattered storefronts had been rebuilt, but poorly. Signs were faded, sidewalks chipped. The world had moved on, but it had left marks everywhere. I stepped off the Greyhound with nothing but a small suitcase and that envelope in my coat pocket. The bus pulled away with a long exhale of diesel and dust, and I stood there, staring down the street where Margaret and I had once walked in the golden evenings of youth. That was before I put on the uniform, before my name disappeared into the war. My legs carried me instinctively toward the heart of town. Main Street, once a lively stretch of diners, shops, and movie posters in neon, now silent. The soda shop where we shared milkshakes was gone. In its place, a feed store with dusty windows and an out-of-business sign hanging crooked. People passed me without recognition. No one knew my face anymore. Maybe no one ever had. It wasn't just the buildings that had changed. It was the sound. Before the war, Springfield had a rhythm, laughter echoing through alleys, music from the community hall, kids yelling down the sidewalks. But now, footsteps were softer. Conversations stayed low, as if everyone had learned to live smaller, quieter. I walked past the train station. My heart almost stopped. The same platform, the same rusty tracks. That's where she had stood, wrapped in her yellow scarf, her eyes shining with hope and fear. That day, I told her I'd be home by Christmas. We kissed as the whistle blew, and then I was gone. And she had waited, at least for a while. At a small grocery store by the corner of Jefferson and Oak, I finally asked someone. An older man with silver hair and suspenders was arranging apples in crates. "Excuse me," I said, "I'm looking for a woman named Margaret Hale. Do you know her?" He looked up slowly, studying my face. "Haven't heard that name in a long time," he muttered. "She lives up near Oak Hill Cemetery, in that old white house with the green shutters. Lives alone. Folks say she lost her fiancé in the war. Never married." My mouth went dry. I nodded a thank you, barely able to speak. She had mourned me, buried me in her mind. And now I was walking toward her door, carrying a letter from another man. A letter filled with someone else's love. The walk to Oak Hill was long. The sidewalks gave way to gravel, and the trees grew thick. I passed houses that seemed frozen in time, with rusted mailboxes and American flags that had faded to pink and white. Then I saw it, the house. White siding, ivy along the porch, curtains drawn. It looked like the kind of place where stories lived, where grief was stored in every drawer, every floorboard. I stood at her front gate for a long while, gripping the letter in my hand. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everything the war had taken, everything I'd lost, everything I had been too afraid to face. I stepped up the path, the wooden porch creaking beneath my feet. I knocked once, then again. When the door opened, it was her. Older, grayer, but those eyes, they were still hers, still full of memory. She stared at me for what felt like forever. Her mouth parted slightly, her hands trembled at her sides. I didn't say my name. I just held out the envelope. She didn't take it at first. She just looked at me, really looked at me. And then softly she whispered, "Are you real?" My voice cracked when I answered, "I am now." I shouldn't have read it. And I knew that the moment my fingers touched the edge of the envelope, the moment I broke the seal and unfolded the paper that wasn't meant for me. But in that quiet room, with the late afternoon light filtering through lace curtains and the scent of old wood and chamomile lingering in the air, I felt something deeper than curiosity, something closer to obligation and, maybe if I'm honest, desperation. The letter had waited years to be read, and though it had been addressed to Margaret Hale, written by a man I didn't know, it felt as if every line was pulling at a corner of my own history, unraveling a thread I had tried so long to bury beneath silence and the weight of time. His handwriting was steady and slanted, the ink slightly faded but still clear, each stroke of the pen precise, deliberate, as if he had known these words might be the last he'd ever write. "Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then I never made it home. And there's 100 things I wish I'd said when I still had the chance. But this is what matters most." I paused, not because I couldn't go on, but because those words, meant for someone else, felt like they were echoing from a place inside me I hadn't dared to visit in years. The part of me that still carried the weight of goodbye, that still remembered her standing at the train station, clutching my dog tags like a promise we never got to fulfill. He wrote with a tenderness I recognized, the kind that only comes when you've seen too much death to pretend anymore, when every letter might be your last chance to tell the truth. He recalled their final afternoon together, a Saturday in May, a farmer's market, the way her laugh rose above the crowd when he dropped a crate of peaches, the warmth of her hand in his, the exact shade of her dress, and how, as she leaned against the edge of his truck, he realized he didn't want to go back to war if it meant leaving that moment behind. "I carry your photograph in my breast pocket on the left side," he wrote. "I press it there at night, hoping it might keep my heart from forgetting what it's like to feel." I clenched the letter tighter. That line, it shattered something. Because I had done the same. In the mud, in the cold, in the moments between silence and shell fire, I had reached for the memory of her face like a man reaching for breath underwater. And yet, unlike him, I had lived to come back and failed to return. His words bled with sincerity, every paragraph a farewell disguised as gratitude, every line an attempt to turn heartbreak into poetry. "I never planned on falling in love with you," he admitted. "But I think love chooses us, not the other way around. If I don't make it back, I want you to know you gave me peace in a place where peace had no business existing." I felt it then. The sharp sting of jealousy, not toward him, not truly, but toward the part of her that had healed in the arms of someone who wasn't me. I had no claim to her pain, no right to feel abandoned, and yet I did, because I had once promised her forever, and when I disappeared into silence, she had kept going. She had survived, and in her survival, she had found another soul to carry her through. When Margaret returned to the room, I was still holding the letter, my thumb resting on the final line. I didn't try to hide it. There was no use pretending. She saw the truth in my eyes before I said a word. "I read it," I confessed, my voice hoarse, not from shame, but from the ache that had crept up my throat like grief, unspoken for far too long. She didn't look angry. She didn't look surprised. She sat down slowly beside me, folding her hands in her lap, her gaze resting on the floor as though she too had been walking through ghosts. "He was good," she said at last. And I heard in those 3 words a whole lifetime of restraint, of quiet memories, of simple companionship forged not from fire and passion, but from necessity and kindness. He helped me believe again when I thought I couldn't. I nodded because what else was there to say? He had filled the silence I left behind. He had given her something I hadn't, presence. "And yet," she continued, turning to me now, her voice soft but unwavering, "when I saw you standing at my door, I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for all along." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth, only time, and the space between who we were and who we had become. I asked her why she hadn't opened the letter before today, why she had left it sealed all these years. She smiled faintly and said, "Because I already knew what he would say, and I didn't want his goodbye to change the way I remembered him." As I folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope, I understood something I had never allowed myself to see, that love does not always end, it simply changes shape. And sometimes the deepest love is the one that knows how to let go. Silence can take many forms, the kind that settles after loss, the kind that speaks louder than words, and the kind that holds you still, as if the room itself is afraid to breathe. In Margaret's living room, with its worn rug, faded floral wallpaper, and a photograph of her parents resting on the mantel, silence became a third presence. It wrapped itself around us not as a void, but as something full, of memory, of weight, of things neither of us dared say aloud. She sat across from me in an armchair that seemed too large for her now, the edges frayed, the fabric sagging slightly at the arms. And for several minutes, we simply sat there, the letter still resting on the table between us, unopened, unread again, as if the act of reading it had already fulfilled its purpose, even without her eyes on its pages. I looked at her and saw both the girl I had left behind and the woman who had carried the burden of years I had not lived. Her hair, once the color of warm sand, was now streaked with silver, tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her hands, resting in her lap, bore the delicate tremble of time. And yet, in her posture, in the sharpness of her gaze, in the way she held the moment, she was still Margaret. I wanted to speak, to fill the room with something other than the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of wind outside the window, but no words came, because everything I could say felt too small, too late. So instead, I let the silence stretch, trusting that she would break it when she was ready. When she finally did, her voice was soft, steady. "Are you happy?" she asked. The question surprised me, not because of its simplicity, but because of how directly it pierced the heart of everything I had avoided. I took a moment before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't sure how to say it. "I'm trying," I said. "Some days I am. Some days I'm still somewhere else." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. as if she too sometimes drifted backward without intending to. "And you?" I asked. "I've learned how to be still," she replied, her eyes fixed on the window now, the light catching the rim of her cheek. "I've learned how to listen to quiet, and I've made peace with waiting, even when no one is coming." There was no self-pity in her voice, only truth, the kind that comes after long years of living with absence. And in that moment I realized that her strength wasn't in how she had moved on, but in how she had carried the silence with her. We talked little after that, a few words about the war, about the town, about the neighbor who brings her milk from the farm. But most of our conversation happened in looks, in half-smile brushed the side of her teacup as if drawing warmth from the past. At one point, I stood and walked to the bookshelf, running my fingers over the spines of old novels and dusty memoirs until I found one tucked between 2 volumes of forgotten poetry. I pulled it out and saw my name inside, scrawled in my own handwriting from before. I turned to her, holding it like a question. "I kept everything," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Even when I thought you were gone, even when I married someone else, even when he died, even when I thought I would never see you again, I kept it all." I sat back down, the book in my lap, unsure of what to say. "I was afraid," I said at last. "Afraid to come back and find that you'd forgotten me, that I'd become a ghost." She reached across the table, her hand resting gently over mine. The touch was light but grounding, the kind of touch that says, "I remember, I forgive, I understand. You were never a ghost to me," she said. "Even when I thought you were dead, I still dreamed in your voice." That did something to me I wasn't prepared for. It broke something open, something I'd locked away for too long, and for a few moments I couldn't look at her without tears rising to my eyes. We didn't talk about the future. There was no plan, no expectation. We both knew that this meeting wasn't meant to begin something new. It was here to close a circle, to give the past a place to rest. As the sky outside dimmed and the cicadas began their evening song, I stood, knowing it was time. She walked me to the door, and before I stepped out onto the porch, she placed something in my hand, a photograph of us, young and bright-eyed, taken the summer before I left. "I want you to have this," she said, "to remember who we were, not with regret, but with love." I held the photo, the paper soft with age, and nodded. Then I leaned in and kissed her forehead, a kiss not of passion, but of reverence. And as I walked down the steps and back toward the quiet of the road, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I thought our time together had ended with the silence, with the letter, with the photo she pressed into my hand like a benediction. But I was wrong, because just as I reached the bottom of the steps, she called after me, not loudly, but with a calm urgency that made me stop mid-step and turn. There was something in her voice, in the way she held herself, that told me this wasn't over, not quite yet. She stood in the doorway, framed by fading sunlight, her hands clasped together as though holding something fragile. "There's something I need to show you," she said, and without waiting for my response, she stepped back and left the door open. I followed her inside, my steps slower now, weighted not with hesitation, but with anticipation, the kind that comes when you sense the truth is close, close enough to touch, close enough to hurt. She led me to a small room off the main hallway, one I hadn't seen before. It smelled of cedar and dust, a place that had been closed for a long time. A writing desk sat against the wall, and above it, shelves lined with books, framed photographs and keepsakes, the remnants of a life lived in quiet. She knelt beside an old trunk in the corner, its leather straps worn thin, its brass latch slightly tarnished, and as she opened it, the hinges groaned like something exhaling after years of silence. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a few yellowed newspapers, and on top, a small, cloth-wrapped box. "This," she said, lifting it with both hands and placing it on the desk, "is what the war didn't take." I watched as she unwrapped it slowly, carefully, and beneath the cloth was a wooden box, not ornate but lovingly worn. When she opened the lid, I saw what was inside and felt the air leave my lungs. Letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her, all in my handwriting. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for one. The return address was from a field hospital in France, the date barely legible, but the words unmistakably mine. I looked at her, searching for an explanation, and she answered without my needing to ask. "They came back to me," she said, her voice low. "After the war, your father sent them. Said he'd found them bundled in your things, never mailed. Or maybe they were lost, intercepted, who knows? But when he passed, they came to me." I sat down hard, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled into my chest. These were my words, thoughts I had long forgotten, fragments of a younger version of myself who still believed he had time, who still believed he'd return to her untouched. I picked up one letter and read the opening line, written in a hand steadier than mine was now. "Maggie, I think about your eyes every night before I close mine." Tears blurred the ink as I read. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was recovery of something I thought I'd lost forever. "I read every one of them," she continued, "again and again. Even after I'd said yes to someone else, even after I wore another man's ring, I read them. And I remembered you. Not with longing, not with sadness, but with clarity. I knew you had loved me. That was enough. I didn't know what to say. My chest was heavy with emotion, not regret, not grief, but a complex, aching kind of gratitude, that my words had found her, eventually, that she had held on to them, that somehow a part of me had stayed with her even when I was gone. "I didn't remarry after Thomas died," she said quietly, running her fingers along the edge of the box. "Not because I couldn't, but because it never felt right. I had had my great loves, one I lived with, one I lost, one I found again, just once, when he knocked on my door holding someone else's letter. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw in her face not just the woman I once knew, but a lifetime. The pain, the strength, the quiet resilience of someone who had lived through war without ever going to battle. And I realized that the most powerful stories aren't written in history books, but in letters never sent, photographs never framed, and rooms like this, where memory sleeps until someone comes looking for it. "I don't know what to do with all this," I admitted, gesturing to the letters, to the box, to everything between us. She smiled, not a sad smile, but one filled with peace. "You already did," she said, and I knew she was right. I left Springfield the next morning just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden wash over the town that once held all my beginnings and for a brief moment welcomed my return. I boarded the Greyhound bus not with regret nor with sorrow, but with something quieter and far more sacred: peace. In my coat pocket was the photograph she had given me. The roads unspooled before me like film from an old projector, fields, towns, power lines flashing past in rhythm with my thoughts. Kansas City came into view in the late afternoon. The city felt bigger now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I walked the streets I once walked as a man who sorted other people's words, unaware that mine still waited somewhere to be heard. Back at my apartment, I unpacked slowly. I placed the photograph in a frame and set it by the window. I opened the box of letters and read one each night, not to remember, but to understand the man I once was. And with each line, I forgave him a little more. Margaret and I didn't speak again after that visit. There were no more letters, no phone calls, no plans, but that was never the purpose of our meeting. We hadn't come together to reignite something. We came to let it rest, to finally say the things that silence had guarded for too long. She passed away the following spring. A neighbor mailed me the obituary clipped from the local paper with a note that read, "She kept that photo on her bedside table until the very end." I sat in my kitchen holding that note and I wept, not out of grief, but from the strange, beautiful ache of knowing I had been remembered. Years have passed since then. My hair has gone grey. My hands aren't as steady. I don't walk as far as I used to. But I still have that box. I still keep her photo by the window. And now, I write this letter not to her, but to you, my daughter. You never knew this chapter of my life. I never told you. Not because it wasn't important, but because I didn't know how. But now, with time behind me and only the truth ahead, I want you to know who your father was before he was just Dad. I was a soldier. I was a boy in love with a girl he thought he lost. I was a man who delivered a letter that wasn't his and found everything he thought the war had taken. Silence, I've learned, can protect us, but truth can set us free. We share new stories every day. True stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. Subscribe and join us.